Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, brought to you today by Josh Edison and Dr. M. Dentith. Hello and welcome to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. I am Josh Edison, they are Dr. M. Dentith. We
are socially distancing.
But only by a little bit, in Auckland, together, in the same room.
And I mean, it's
Magic.
basically virtue signalling, because we were French kissing before, but
Well,
now
yes.
we're looking distant.
It's all
on
about
video
appearances, you know.
to make
yes.
sure that you know at home you should also socially distance and not French kiss your co-host.
No, yes, I licked every doorknob on the way here. Not a euphemism.
Well, it is.
Well, it's not a euphemism, it's a lie. I suppose for our overseas viewers, maybe bit of the old COVID update, I suppose, here in New Zealand. So Auckland is now out of its temporary lockdown, but into a less severe lockdown where we're still supposed to be responsibly socially distancing. And
we could have 8 more people in this room.
we could.
But that's it.
That's it, yep. No. Gatherings of 10 people. And an interesting change from last time, they've made mask wearing mandatory, but only on public transport at the moment. But it's strongly encouraged elsewhere.
It is. And that means there are people engaging in mask-related protests.
Yep, a little bit. There was one fella on the news the other day who sort of went on his Instagram or whatever about how he didn't wear him and his partner didn't wear their masks on the train, and someone sort of had a word with them and kind of said, "You should wear your mask, dude." And he said, "Well, you're going to arrest me?" And he said, "No, but wear your mask." But then he was all like, "Aha, you see, know your rights. They can't make me wear a mask." That's not the attitude of a 3-year-old.
No, I must say, because I'm involved in a project at the moment looking at COVID-19 disinformation and conspiracy theories in the build-up to the election here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I am of the firm opinion that our she'll be right attitude of we'll talk to the people first and tell them they're doing wrong, and then eventually we'll find them once they've done it 2 or 3 times, is the wrong attitude, because it only requires one person to be asymptomatic with COVID-19, not wearing a mask on public transport, for that to be a vector for infection for a large number of people. So in that situation, I think instant fines all the time.
Well, yes. Yeah, I mean, there's been, as with anything, there's been a fair bit of political calculus. I mean, people are always sort of saying, oh, it shouldn't be a political decision, but it's a decision being made by politicians. Surely it's political by definition, and in that we went down to this level when, like, previously we had the big 4-week massive lockdown of the whole country, and we came out of that when there had been sort of 0 new cases for several days and so on. We're still getting cases popping up at the moment. But I think people fairly rightly assumed that if they carried on the lockdown too long, then people would start acting like dicks anyway. So it's a bit of a balancing act between what would be the best, most sensible thing to do in medical terms, and what's going to piss people off the least and have least risk of a backlash.
Yes, there's the calculations which, in a few years' time, we'll be probably looking back upon with the benefit of hindsight and going, maybe we should have gone harder for another week in lockdown, or maybe we should have gone harder for 3 more weeks in lockdown.
Yes, we'll just have to see. But anyway, so that's where we are. We can go out, we can do things. We should just probably be wearing a mask while we do it. But we don't have to, unless we're on a train.
But we
then
should.
We might get away with it anyway. But we should.
We should.
Yes.
We should.
Now, Conspiracy Theory Masterpiece Theatre.
Indeed, another exciting episode where we'll be delving into the work of an author we've covered several times before on this illustrious podcast.
An author who you could possibly describe in 2 words as both resilient and ubiquitous.
It's very true, and has many thoughts, both after and before?
Before what? The chime?
The chime. Nice rescue.
Yes, so today we are looking at Afterthoughts on Conspiracy, Resilience and Ubiquity by one Lee Basham. Now this one I assume is another chapter from the book, from the Conspiracy Theories, the Philosophical Debate.
It is indeed. So yes, we are now looking at Lee's contribution to Conspiracy Theories, the Philosophical Debate, as edited by David Cody. and published by Ashgate.
Ashgate?
Not Ass.
Not
as in
Ashgate.
Ashgate.
No.
Ashgate. Ashgate?
The gate that you let your asses in and out of.
It's true, and not asses,
No.
as maybe Americans might say. Back in 2006.
So, this continues as we're pretty much used to by now, the whole point-counterpoint debate kind of thing. We had Brian Keeley said something, Lee Basham reacted to that, Brian reacted to that, and now Lee's reacting straight on back again.
No, you forget about Steve reacting to
Well,
things
yeah,
as
but
well.
then mixed in, Steve reacted to stuff, and so everyone's reacting to everyone. It's positively filthy.
It's quite reactive.
So another fairly short one.
Only about 2,500 words,
Yes.
but there's a lot packed in there.
There really is. So obviously, as in all the cases of these conspiracy theory masterpiece theatre ones, this is something with which you're intimately familiar, but with which I was reading for the first time. And yeah, reading this, it did seem to sort of solidify the idea that where you sort of had the likes of Brian Keeley taking an epistemological, or a look at the epistemology of conspiracy theories themselves, and then you have Steve Clark, who, rather than doing that, sort of went off to look at the psychology of conspiracy theorists. And Lee Basham really does seem to be most into looking at sort of society, the world in which these conspiracy theories occur and in which these conspiracy theorists operate.
In which
and
case,
what
he's
that can
basically
tell us.
doing social epistemology at this stage. So looking at the situation of epistemic knowers, such as ourselves, in communities of other knowers or epistemic agents. And so he's going, well, look, given the kind of societies we exist in, and given the kind of assumption expectations of the societies in which we exist, our knowledge is constrained or liberated, depending on what those assumptions are. And so we can't do conspiracy theory without thinking about actual conspiracies and the history of conspiracy in our polities.
Does social epistemology get applied to numerous other areas? How's that?
I mean, so social epistemology basically is going away from the individualized epistemology that's kind of traditional in the Western canon of being focused on individual epistemic agents engaging in, well, how do I know X? Well, I know X because I've a justified true belief that blah. And social epistemology goes, well, actually, hold on. A lot of our knowledge is constituted by social mores, social connections, trust and the like. And so to do epistemology, you really do need to think about society as a whole and how that constrains or liberates you as an epistemic agent within that society. So it applies to basically everything. So standpoint epistemology, where you go, well, if I was a woman in the society, how would this affect my ability to gain information, ends up being part of the social epistemology pantheon. So it applies to lots of different fields. You do the social epistemology of politics, the social epistemology of science. We start thinking about groups of scientific agents engaging in scientific inquiry. There are limits to those inquiries depending on the kind of society in which you live. Social epistemology applies to everything.
Well, John,
it's
good.
everywhere, Josh. You're breathing it in now.
Yum. Now, I guess we should start with the opening paragraph. Is it my turn?
It is your, well, I've said it's always your turn.
It's always my turn. Okay. So, Lee Basham's paper, Afterthoughts on Conspiracy Theory, Resilience and Ubiquity, begins as follows. Recent work in epistemology has tried to pinpoint adequate grounds for rejecting conspiracy theories as unwarranted, but little of it appears to succeed. What has emerged instead is that conspiracy theories turn out to be remarkably wily and resilient epistemic creatures. They are extremely difficult to discount. A primary concern is that contemporary philosophers have put far too much effort into trying to discredit conspiracy and intelligent attempts to identify it, instead of achieving a better appreciation of conspiracy and conspiracy theory's natural place in life, and then embracing a more honest respect for conspiracy's powerful potential in our world. A dismissive attitude toward conspiracy and its theory is to be expected, I suppose, from those in the grips of the official civil religion of Western free democracies, that we live in an open society consisting of mutually balancing centres of power governed by the informed will of impartial, compassionate citizen consumers. A dismissive attitude and attendant rationalisations is also natural for those surrounded by the economic ease and the securities of an affluent Western lifestyle, but I do not believe it is quite the best philosophical attitude. I suspect it is merely a comforting and ultimately negligent mythology.
Quite a lot of buzzwords there.
Quite a bit of, he's nailing his colours to the mast or the flagpole or whatever it is you nail colours onto right there.
And what are those colours, Joshua?
Oh, green.
Interesting choice.
So, he starts off basically addressing Brian L. Keeley's reactions to him. So if you remember from Nobody Expects the Spanish Inquisition, where he finished by saying basically, if one wishes to be malevolent on a global scale, why waste time and energy maintaining a conspiracy when history shows that one can get away with it in the open? Sort of arguing against this idea that society that Lee put forward, that sort of the world we live in is a world in which conspiracies occur, and we don't have the sort of trust in social institutions that would allow
Also called
us.
pragmatic rejection.
And Brian L. Keeley said, but hang on, like look at these things that happened. The Holocaust happened, the Spanish Inquisition, witch trials, all sorts of things happened, and they didn't. And even where things happened a little bit in secret, like the Dunkirk landings in World War II, they were secret to a point in terms of the details, but everybody knew that the attack was coming. They just weren't quite sure the exact details. So he basically said, you don't need to posit these grand overarching conspiracies because people,
These malevolent global
ones, because people are perfectly capable of being malevolent on a global scale without the need for conspiracy. And so Basham nevertheless has a counter to that.
He does, which is to say, well, yes, we can accept that the Dunkirk landings were kind of signalled, even if elements were kept secret. We can expect the Spanish Inquisition. We can expect that people will do some fairly dreadful things in the open. But conversely, a lot of the planning of these dreadful things is done in secret. Because if you plan these dreadful things openly from the get-go, people are going to stop you. So we need to be talking about the prior stuff that gets us to those vile deeds. Although I suppose the Dunkirk landings really wasn't particularly vile at all.
Yes, no, the Holocaust was I think the one that gets brought up in the paper a bit.
You need to think about, well, how did they get to the point where they could start acting in the open? Because that's the point we need to be talking about conspiracy.
Yes, indeed. When Keeley says, why do you need to have a conspiracy when history shows you can get away with it in the open, Lee basically says, so that you can get away with it in the open. Yes, the Nazis weren't campaigning for day one on we're going to do our best to exterminate the Jewish people, although that that was presumably Hitler's goal all along. A lot of the preparation, a lot of the initial planning happened in secret, and had they been completely open about it, they may very well not have got away with it. And Lee Basham reacts to Brian Keeley's claim that it's while he's quite willing to accept that conspiracy theories they are common, low-level ones, high-level ones happen all the time, but he said, there's a big jump from adultery and insider trading, with his examples, to global conspiracies. But then Lee Basham, again sticking with the Spanish Inquisition, talked about how, in that you sort of had people being targeted for political ends or to intimidate and so on, and that would sort of happen at a larger level, but then sort of down into villages, and then sort of possibly down at the level of family and so on. And so the same thing that operates at a higher society level can operate at a smaller personal level anyway. So possibly the distinction between the smaller scale adultery, businesses, insider trading, and large-scale global malevolent conspiracies is not as important.
Which is why he talks about the ubiquity of conspiracy and notes, it is important to keep before us the fact that far from being a nefarious fringe activity, conspiracy and its theory are commonplace within the most profound personal experiences and commitments of billions of human beings. Far from a rarity, both conspiracy and its theory are fundamental modes of human cognition and have been for millennia. So this is Lee's claim that, look, part of the problem with this discussion of conspiracy and conspiracy theory is that we think these conspiracies are rare, and thus we can appraise them as if they are uncommon events. Lee counters that by going, well, look, actually, conspiracies happen all the time, from the organisation of surprise parties to large-scale political malfeasance. It's all a spectrum of conspiracy there. And people theorise about these conspiracies all the time. If you think that your friends are organising a surprise party and they are keeping it from you, you are theorising about a conspiracy, in the same way that if you think that the government is keeping something from you about their COVID-19 response, you are also theorising about a conspiracy. Both cases are commonplace, and we should recognise that people have these suspicions all the time, and it's perfectly normal.
And then he makes a slightly eye-opening move, in that my eyes were open while I read it, because that's how reading works.
You should have got the audiobook.
Well, yes. Not available.
Then you could have
in
said
zone,
my eyes
unfortunately.
flicked open when I heard the following words.
Well, Lee basically says that organised theistic religion is kind of the ultimate conspiracy, and one that has been with us for thousands of years, and probably before recorded human history.
Time you put in, dun, dun, dun.
Because he describes traditional theistic religion as any belief that accepts, 1, the world is the creation of a morally superior, powerful supernatural intelligence, or God. 2, the world has suffered the introduction of a power, evil, or some other highly undesirable causal property, such as pan-illusion or Maya. 3, this power has a supernatural dimension. Supernatural intelligences exercise it on their own and via human beings. 4, the Creator actively resists the efforts of these agents of evil on its own and through human beings. 5, both these good and evil intelligences are presently active in our world and influence many momentous personal and world events. And finally 6, much, easily most of their activity is intentionally hidden from the majority of humanity. So it sounds like he's describing parties working together in secret for a common goal.
And indeed, this is a common refrain in the skeptical literature, to moving outside of philosophy into largely American skepticism, and the notion that organised religion is kind of a scam designed to milk or grift its followers, and the idea that actually believing in these higher powers operating behind the scenes does seem a lot like subscribing to an official conspiracy theory that it's okay to believe in.
And then he sort of goes on to say, okay, well, if you change God, replace God in his previous definition with sort of forces of democracy or America, and evil with communism, then you have the sorts of conspiracy theories that the John Birch Society trafficked in. If you replace communism with Islamism, then you have plenty of the anti-Muslim type conspiracy theories, which we still see plenty of to this very day.
And indeed, because this was written back in 2006, Lee is making particular reference to the US Attorney General John Ashcroft, who was the Attorney General under the W. Bush administration, that talked about a vague Al-Qaeda conspiracy theory, which was of course part of the rationale for the invasions of both Afghanistan and also Iraq.
So he's basically, so he then says theists of the nature he described are conspiracy theorists. If they are right, the essential trajectory of the world is a conspiracy. So he's basically sort of rounding out by saying that conspiracy is baked into the very fabric of society, and has been for a decent chunk of human history.
Now what's interesting about this, as we will see in a few weeks' time, there's a more recent paper by a friend of the show, Brian L. Keeley, about God as the ultimate conspirator.
Ooh.
So we'll be returning back to this interesting tangent about religion very soon.
But for now, let's turn, as Lee Basham does, at this point to looking at what Steve Clark had to say. You'll remember his talk of degenerative research theories.
In a kind of Lakatoshian mode. So doing the philosophy of science from the point of Imre Lakatos, as opposed to, say, your Thomas Kuhn.
And you recall his he doesn't go into so much of the psychology of it, but it's more the way that Clarke treats it in a sort of philosophy of science mode. And has a look at what he says. I mean, first of all, he makes the point that it isn't quite clear, and I believe Clarke said this himself in his own paper, when a research theory becomes degenerative in the same way that we've seen problems with Brian L. Keeley talking about his mature, unwarranted conspiracy theories. When exactly is it mature?
Something I'm still struggling with my own work with respect to COVID-19, given that COVID-19 conspiracy theories are relatively new, given they emerged at the earliest back in November of last year, or most likely actually around about March of this year. And yet I'm labelling a whole bunch of those as being unwarranted conspiracy theories because they appear to be quite mature, and yet no good evidence is presenting. So it is a rather vague metric.
Although, as I think you said, and I know I've heard Joe Skinsky say, a lot of these quote-unquote new conspiracy theories do tend to sort of base themselves on existing ones that have been around for ages and ages and just sort of piggyback on, just put a new veneer over the...
Yes, so there are certain archetypes you see repeated again and again and again, where the only new thing is going, oh, what crisis can we apply this particular claim of conspiracy to? Oh, in this particular case, it's COVID-19. It was 5G earlier on. Before that, it was 4G radio signals causing cancer. Before that, it was probably the radio. Before that, it was reading. Or before reading, it was, etc., etc.
Yes. But anyway, that's sort of more of a side point, really. He goes on to say that treating conspiracy theories in the same way that you do philosophy of science is a problem. In particular, quoting here, the real problem with appealing to it in the context of conspiracy theory is that while nature does not presumably fake the data essential to our physical theories, in the case of our social theories, people do, which is a point that's come up before, and I cannot for the life of me remember where. Who first said that?
That is Brian L. Keeley.
Ah, well, there we go. Yes, so I mean, it isn't. The two aren't entirely directly comparable because you don't. Part of the nature of conspiracy theories is that people are trying to hide themselves from you, whereas you would hope that the object of a scientific study is meant to be just this permanent objective reality that you're trying to get to grips with. So maybe that's our first suggestion, that possibly we're off in the wrong direction. And when he gets down to it, you sort of actually let's just read the quote. The apparent degenerate status of a conspiracy theory, failure to be able to generate a great many new successful predictions, and reliance on auxiliary hypothesis to maintain the theory is exactly what a fairly well-constructed conspiracy would eventually leave investigators with. A closed door to additional investigation and a wealth of false leads and disinformation produced by the conspirators and those they influence, in order to obscure the conspiracy. So we've only returned to the question, how do we distinguish good from bad conspiracy theories? And this is one that he sort of comes back to a bunch of times throughout the paper. As we look at these things, we're trying to sort of talk about conspiracy theories, but then we end up just bottoming out in, well, okay, then there are good ones and bad ones, and how do we tell the two apart, which is not allegedly what these people were trying to figure out in the first place.
No, so he continues, an answer to this question should determine when we take a positive or negative attitude towards a conspiracy theory, not anything believed about conspiracy theorists as a group.
Which sounds an awful lot like a particularist viewpoint.
Indeed, and very soon we'll be looking at the two people who coined the notion of particularism and generalism in this field, which is Bunting and Taylor. Their work will be coming up very soon, and it's a fascinating paper for the sheer fact that it's flawed, and yet its central contribution, which is talking about generalism versus particularism, is very important for labelling a whole bunch of practices. And the two authors themselves have completely left the game. So they wrote this very important, although I say flawed, paper about how we appraise, how we talk about conspiracy theory and its analysis, and I don't even know whether they're aware of how well they're cited now.
Oh well, another one to look forward to. So this is where Lee Basham finds himself, pointing out that when we try to evaluate conspiracy theories in general, we end up instead having to distinguish between particular ones because we know that some conspiracies happened. We can look at the history of the world, of all these conspiracies that were real, that people had theories about, that turned out to be true. And we want to accept or reject, if we're taking the particular viewpoint, we want to accept or reject these things based on their evidence, but as he just said, a lot of the time the evidence is the thing we don't actually have full access to.
And indeed is the kind of thing that conspiracy theorists are concerned about, that there are things we're not being told we ought to know about.
And so then Lee comes back to, I think, his point that he's made in his previous papers: we should acknowledge the implications of this lack, a studied agnosticism about many of the current conspiracy theories that proliferate around the globe. And when I read that, I did have to wonder, though, is like in the past that we were interested in epistemological warrant, so not necessarily are these things true, but should we believe them?
Whether they're plausible to believe given the available evidence.
And so in the previous papers where Brian L. Keeley has been reacting to his views and so on, he's made a point of saying the distinguishing between truth and warrant. We may not be able to tell if a conspiracy theory is true, but maybe we can say whether or not it's warranted. And also the difference between whether it's possible and warranted, because again in the previous paper he said, well, yes, it's possible that any giant malevolent global conspiracy you want to name could be happening, but we're not interested in possibility, we're interested in warrant. And is Lee talking about warrant here, or has he moved away from it a bit?
So I think part of the problem here, and this is part of my reappraisal of Brian's paper, is that actually there are multiple ways of talking about warrant within philosophy, which is it justifiable to believe versus is it justifiable to believe given the available evidence we have at a time. And I think Lee is concerned with the first form, which is if you don't have enough evidence, then you should just be agnostic. Whilst Brian, I think, is more concerned with the second sense, which is actually we kind of have to make decisions given the available evidence we have. So we can be worried that there's evidence out there we can't see, but we can't do anything about it. We simply have to make decisions about whether we think something is plausible given what we know now and an acknowledgement of our limitations. So I think there's a disjunct here between the two ways that they're talking about warrant in an epistemological way. But I do have to ask a very important question here, Josh. Are you wearing Captain America's shoes?
No, they just happen to... I'm wearing Cons. I'm wearing Converse shoes, and the symbol of Converse shoes, of course, is the star, and it just so happens that these shoes are
red, white and blue,
well,
with a white star on the side.
They're white and blue with a little bit of red on them, but not really Captain America shoes. They're just...
You do know he's dead. Have you stolen Captain America's shoes?
In what continuity are we talking about?
I don't know. I don't watch Marvel films.
No, well, there you go. I thought you were talking about Chris Evans is dead. He hasn't got... The Rock's got COVID, but Chris Evans hasn't, as far as I know.
And Black Panther's dead.
What the hell is up with that? Chadwick Boseman, 43 years old.
Well, so actually, even though we normally get to the pop culture stuff at the end, we're going to do it now. So there's actually been a kind of interesting conspiracy about that for a while, in that it's been fairly obvious that the scribes at the MCU have been looking at making one of the other main characters from Black Panther the eventual replacement to Black Panther. And people online were going, oh, Chadwick Boseman must be really, really angry. He's only got to make one film, and they're already looking for his successor. I mean, it's woman's lib gone mad, etc., etc. And now everyone's being quiet because people are going, no, maybe the MCU were looking for a replacement for Chadwick Boseman because Chadwick Boseman was dying of cancer. And presumably he wasn't thinking, oh, it's really annoying you're replacing me. He was probably actually going, if I live long enough, we can do a film to pass the mantle on. And it turns out that hasn't happened.
Oh, yes, very, very unfortunate.
Yeah, very sad, very sad.
Most sad. But anyway, returning to the paper, we're nearly at the end here anyway. So Lee Basham...
not Chadwick Boseman.
Not Chadwick Boseman, no. Goes to talk in favour of a general definition of what counts as a conspiracy, as I mean, just sort of rounding out his views here at the bottom. And he says something which was quite interesting to me. This paragraph near the end of his paper says, "We also need to be cautious about unduly limiting the notion of a conspiracy theory, perhaps in the service of our own political expectations. It is perfectly general. It is a functional term, a term that identifies a phenomenon in terms of how it works. Conspiracy theory works to explain various events in particular ways. Whatever does this, regardless of who offers it to us, is a conspiracy theory. For this reason, conspiracy theories can be both obscure and utterly mainstream," in direct opposition to, what was it, David Cody's one previously. And then finishes by saying, "The current popular and official understanding of the attack on the United States World Trade Center is a conspiracy theory. Its main explanatory elements are conspirators and their conspiracies. It is hard to imagine any explanation of this event that isn't," which is a point we've made over and over again in this podcast. Is that the first time somebody made that point?
In philosophy, yes.
Well, there you go.
It may have been made by non-philosophers elsewhere, but yes, in philosophy, this is the first time it's been written down.
Well, there we go. So you heard it here first, only you didn't, but Lee wrote it here first.
You heard it here 14 years after it was written.
And so there we go. So the next bit in my notes is the conclusion to all of this. Is there anything you'd like to say before we get there?
No, I mean, well, no, and then, but actually
Yes.
I've got something else to say. So yes, and I should just say nothing and then complete the circuit.
Yes.
What is interesting about what's going on here is this does appear to be the first paper to go, look, here's our theory of what counts as a conspiracy theory. The only way to sort between good and bad examples of conspiracy theories is looking at the evidence. Isn't it terrible that we might not have all the evidence we would like, but at the same time, we can only judge whether a conspiracy is good or bad on the evidence. We cannot walk into this debate with assumptions about whether conspiracy theories are prima facie good or bad. We can only engage in evidentialism about them.
So Lee Basham sums it up by saying, "Taking all this to heart, conspiracy's murderous preparatory history, the human universality of conspiracy and its theory, the current epistemic resilience of conspiracy theory, we should not be surprised when accusations of conspiracy, even global, arise. Nor should we be immediately dismissive. It would be surprising if such a powerful and commonplace cognitive template failed to sometimes animate our lives in even great stretches of human history. This, if anything, is the proper attitude for those whom Clarke calls intellectuals. My own experience is rather different than his, however, because in my own experience, it frequently is."
Now that's actually a dig at Clarke for Clarke trying to justify the suspicion that intellectuals have about conspiracy theories, because Basham is going, should we even think it's worth justifying in the first place? As in, is this, as Charles Pigton would call it, just a modern superstition?
And there we go. Yes, so this one did seem quite sort of significant to read, I guess. It seemed to really set up some of the quite fundamental concepts, I suppose, in conspiracy theory.
What you could call it is the end of the plot arc for the first season of Conspiracy Theory in Philosophy.
Yes, that's be very good. I thought you were going to say seminal, and we're going to have a good snigger like we did about the old in the old times.
I mean, the old
Which
times
would-
as in 2 or 3 weeks ago.
As in a few months ago, yeah. Yes, so another interesting little read there. But I assume we have new, interesting, different places to go.
Well, the next major piece I think we're going to read is a piece by Charles Pigton.
Ah,
And it's quite Shakespearean. And I mean that literally. It's quite Shakespearean.
I look forward to it then. You can look forward to it in 2 weeks' time, I suppose.
You can.
Next week, do we know what we're doing next? Last week? We did one of those. We haven't talked about this yet, have we? We should talk about that moments. I can't remember what it was. Was it loose change? We were talking about something. Said that's the thing we've never actually devoted an episode to.
It'll be in the bonus episode because, of course, last week was the
Was
David
the David Ferrier
interview.
interview? Yes.
And yes, and we always plan to make a note of...
And we never do.
So if you're listening to this podcast and remember what we promised to do last week, please do get in contact with us to tell us what we promised to do so we actually get round to doing it, so we don't break the promise, because the problem is that then requires us to go back and listen to our own work, and I'm frankly reluctant to do that at the best of times.
I usually do, just to see how it turned out, but Maybe
Well,
I
your
can do that
task
again.
is
I
to
can.
find out what we
I'm
promised
almost
to do.
certain it was loose change because we keep talking about it, but we've never actually gone through it in detail and everything. Because I brought it up a few weeks ago when I said it was 2007, which is when things really kicked off. And probably
Josh,
why it
it's,
hasn't.
it's 2020. 13
Yes.
years have passed. We've got COVID-19. If you don't know about COVID-19, you're in for a wild ride.
Well, you can catch me up later. But and then you said, when I said Loose Change came out 2007, you said which edition of that was that, and I said I don't know.
Did, yeah.
And then, but then I looked back and okay, yes, 2007 was like the third edition. 2005 was when the very first edition of it came out.
Okay, so it turns out it wasn't Loose Change that we promised to do in the previous episode. Please get in contact with us to tell us what else we're meant to be doing as our social secretaries.
Exactly. So next week we might talk about Loose Change or something else entirely. I don't
Well,
know.
actually, next week's liable to be another interview.
Oh, we've got one teed up, have you?
We've got two teed up. We've got a Joe Usinski and a Brian Alkeely.
Joe Usinski must be sick of talking to people by now, mustn't he? He's
Well,
been all
actually,
over the shop.
I want to talk to Joe about polling.
Ah, right. Because now I did see, who was it? Someone was linking today about some other survey that reckoned only 14% of Americans hadn't heard of QAnon, and that it was it seemed to say almost the exact opposite of what some of Joe's surveys
Where was
said.
that? Where was that linked?
It was probably on Twitter, which is...
Was it linked? Was it sent to us, or did you just see it?
No, I just saw someone talking about it on Twitter. It's
Track that
probably
down.
something David
Track
Ferrier
that
linked
down.
to. I'll have a look, yes. Because that would be interesting.
It would. Now, what is also interesting is the patron bonus content that we give to our patrons, who may or may not be acting as our social secretaries at this point in time. Not this particular point in time, just this point in time. So this week we'll be looking at, well, a story about QAnon, which is a
Fancy
counter
that.
to a story about QAnon we told last week. We'll be continuing our investigation into the poisoning of Alexei Navalny.
Navalny,
Navalny.
I think.
Perestroika. We'll be looking at even more Russian interference in the American election.
those wacky Russians.
I know. And then we'll be talking about how Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, can see demons.
Yes, that is a thing we will talk about.
There'll probably be a reference to his appearance in News Radio.
I don't see how we could stop it, quite
And
frankly.
Babylon 5.
I never watched
Two of my
Babylon 5.
favourite shows ruined by Scott Adams being in them.
Ruin's a strong word, but yes, certainly
No,
tainted.
I stand by it, ruined.
Okay. So if you're a patron, stick around and you'll hear some of that when you listen to the bonus episode. If you're not a patron and you'd like to be, then just be one.
Yeah.
Go to patreon.com and look us up. We're there.
$1 a month is all it requires.
If you're not a patron but you're still listening to this, thank you as well, because you're our audience, and that's just peachy.
Yep. We appreciate you. Just not as much as our patrons.
No. Won't be licking your doorknobs, that's for sure.
Not a euphemism. Yes, it's a euphemism.
It's a bit of a... It goes both ways, just like your mum. Now, I think we're at the end of the
My
episode.
mother who's upstairs.
And also downstairs. I don't know. There's a... Don't tease out my sexual dysphonisms. You heard me.
Yeah, no, sorry, I've just got S Club 7's Don't Stop in my head. Don't
Okay.
stop. Yeah, ba-do-bop.
I thought, didn't they have this...
Yeah, well, they also did Don't Stop Moving to that funky
See,
beat.
I never got into the S Club 7, not even at the time. So I'm afraid I'm not hip to their jive.
Oh, you missed out on looking at Bradley go, Bradley.
Anyway, let's leave them with that image of Bradley. Bradley.
Bradley.
And until next week, I will say goodbye.
And I'll say Bradley. Bradley.
Bradley. Was he the blonde one?
No, he was the black British one.
Right. See,
God's sake.
I know none of this.
You've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, starring Josh Addison and Dr. MRX Denton, which is written, researched, recorded and produced by Josh and M. You can support the podcast by becoming a patron via its Podbean or Patreon campaigns. And if you need to get in contact with either Josh or M, you can email them at podcastconspiracy@gmail.com or check their Twitter accounts, Monkey Fluids and Conspiracism. And remember, it's just a step to the left.